In July 1982, a teenage girl disappeared after leaving a motel area near Seattle, Washington.
Days later, her body was discovered near a river outside the city, with evidence showing she had been strangled before being abandoned in the woods.
Only weeks later, another young woman vanished after being seen entering a pickup truck driven by an unknown man. And investigators connected the disappearance to the earlier murder after another body appeared near the same river.
Then, more victims started appearing across forests, roadside embankments, and isolated locations surrounding King County, and detectives realized they were dealing with a serial killer moving quickly across multiple areas.
Witnesses repeatedly described a calm man driving through neighborhoods known for prostitution, and several survivors later reported escaping violent encounters after entering his vehicle.
One woman survived after jumping from a moving truck and described the driver attempting to strangle her before she escaped into traffic.
And police used her statement to build one of the first detailed suspect descriptions.
As bodies continued appearing, investigators discovered many victims had disappeared within hours of last being seen near highways, convenience stores, and motel districts across Seattle. Detectives searched wooded areas and found clusters of remains hidden only short distances from roads, indicating the killer knew the terrain well and revisited dump sites repeatedly. Then, investigators recovered tire impressions near one body and linked them to a specific type of pickup truck seen by multiple witnesses during the disappearances.
A witness later reported seeing a suspicious man washing the inside of his truck at a self-service car wash only hours after one victim vanished, and investigators began tracing vehicles matching the description.
Police interviewed hundreds of men connected to areas where victims disappeared, and one name kept resurfacing through witness statements, employment records, and vehicle descriptions.
That man was Gary Ridgway, a truck painter living near Seattle,
who had previous contact with police and had been questioned after surviving witnesses described encounters similar to his behavior.
Investigators secretly followed him and observed him driving repeatedly through areas connected to the disappearances while stopping near locations where victims were last seen alive.
During one surveillance operation, detectives watched Ridgway pick up a woman before driving toward isolated roads outside the city, but officers lost sight of the vehicle in wooded terrain.
The following day, another victim disappeared from the same area.
Police searched Ridgway's truck and recovered fibers, hair samples, and traces linking him indirectly to several victims, but forensic technology at the time could not fully confirm the evidence.
Then, another survivor escaped after fighting back inside a vehicle and described the suspect calmly continuing to drive while attempting to choke her with one hand.
Her description matched Ridgway again, and investigators intensified surveillance around his movements.
Meanwhile, search teams discovered more bodies hidden in ravines, forests, and riverbanks, often grouped together in locations difficult to access without knowledge of the terrain. Detectives mapped every discovery and realized the killer frequently returned to old dump sites, moving remains and selecting isolated routes to avoid witnesses. One hunter later stumbled upon skeletal remains in dense woodland, and forensic teams connected them to another missing woman who had vanished months earlier near the airport district.
As the number of victims increased, investigators created one of the largest serial murder task forces in American history and reviewed thousands of witness statements, vehicle records, and missing persons reports.
Police eventually conducted polygraph examinations on Ridgway, and despite suspicious answers, they lacked enough physical evidence for an arrest. Then, investigators recovered paint particles and carpet fibers from several victims. They closely matched materials used at Ridgway's workplace and home. Detectives also learned he frequently visited areas where women disappeared shortly before bodies were later discovered nearby.
One undercover officer reported seeing Ridgway slowly driving through streets searching for women before abruptly leaving toward wooded roads outside the city.
Investigators tracked locations connected to his movements and realized many overlapped directly with body recovery sites spread across Washington state. Then, another major discovery changed the investigation when forensic scientists preserved biological evidence from victims in storage, hoping future technology would eventually identify the killer.
Years passed while bodies continued being identified from remains discovered across forests, riverbanks, and isolated clearings connected to the same pattern of murders.
During the late 1990s, advances in DNA testing finally allowed investigators to re-examine evidence collected years earlier from several victims and compare it directly against Gary Ridgway.
The results linked him to multiple murders immediately, and detectives launched covert operations to gather final confirmation before making an arrest.
Undercover teams collected discarded items used by Ridgway, including saliva samples, and laboratory analysis matched the DNA directly to evidence recovered from victims connected to the Green River murders.
In November 2001, detectives arrested Gary Ridgway near his workplace after DNA evidence finally connected him directly to multiple murders committed during the 1980s.
Investigators searched his home, vehicles, storage areas, and work locations, recovering maps, fibers, personal items, and evidence linked to victims who had disappeared years earlier.
During questioning, Ridgway admitted picking up women across Seattle and driving them to isolated locations near rivers, forests, and abandoned roads,
before killing them and hiding the bodies.
He described revisiting dump sites repeatedly, moving remains and selecting locations where dense vegetation concealed bodies from search teams for long periods.
Detectives then escorted him through forests and remote terrain across Washington, where he pointed out locations investigators had never fully searched before.
Search crews recovered additional remains from several sites connected directly to his statements, and many victims were finally identified years after disappearing.
Ridgway explained how we avoided detection by changing routes, using different roads, and cleaning vehicles immediately after murders before returning to normal routines.
Investigators reconstructed timelines showing he sometimes committed multiple murders within short periods while continuing to work daily without drawing attention.
One recovered site contained remains from victims missing for over a decade, hidden beneath thick forest growth, only meters away from roads frequently used by the public.
Detectives also discovered Ridgway often targeted women near highways because escape routes allowed him to leave crime scenes quickly before disappearances were noticed.
Forensic teams compared DNA recovered from victims with evidence gathered from Ridgway's vehicles, carpets, paint materials, and personal belongings, confirming links across numerous cases.
During interviews, he described approaching women calmly, offering rides, and driving towards isolated wooded areas before sudden attacks inside the vehicle.
Investigators used his statements alongside maps, witness accounts, and forensic evidence to connect dozens of disappearances, stretching back to 1982.
Search operations expanded again after Ridgway identified additional body disposal sites near rivers, ravines, and construction areas outside Seattle.
One victim was recovered from woodland terrain searched unsuccessfully years earlier, proving the killer had concealed remains in extremely remote locations.
Detectives discovered he frequently returned to crime scenes after police activity decreased and sometimes moved remains to prevent discovery during ongoing searches.
Evidence also showed he monitored news reports about missing women and investigations while continuing to drive through areas connected to victims.
As prosecutors prepared charges, investigators reviewed decades of evidence, including fibers, paint samples, DNA, witness descriptions, vehicle sightings, and Ridgway's own admissions. The complete timeline revealed a non-stop sequence of disappearances, murders, body disposals, and movements across Washington, spanning nearly 20 years. Court proceedings focused heavily on forensic evidence and recovered remains, while Ridgway continued guiding investigators toward hidden locations connected to additional victims. By the end of the investigation, authorities connected him to one of the largest confirmed serial murder cases in United States history, with dozens of victims spread across forests, rivers, and isolated terrain surrounding Seattle. Even after sentencing, investigators continued searching areas identified by Ridgway because some victims connected to the disappearances were never fully recovered.